Hi, so my name's Wesley. I'm going to be doing a presentation I'm calling Two Books Looking at the New Testament and the Quran. And the reason I'm doing this presentation is because I do Christian apologetics as a career. I'm the Central Canadian Director for an organization called Apologetics Canada, which is a Christian apologetics organization. I'm also a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto in the area of what's called New Testament and Christian origins. And basically what I do is I study the transmission of the early New Testament text and documents from antiquity and the early Middle Ages. And so within that area of study, I've done some comparative analysis work on Christian documents versus other ancient religious documents. Now that includes both Roman, but I've also done some extensive work on the Quran, the Quranic documents, and sort of the transmission of the history coming from the 7th century and onwards. And so what I'm going to be talking about in this particular presentation is highlighting what we mean when we talk about the differences between these two books. And so if I share my screen, what I'm going to do is I'm going to play this presentation on Mac. And I'm going to look at, in particular, 4 key questions. And those key questions are, what do we see when we look at the transmission of the biblical New Testament? What do we see when we look at the transmission of the Islamic Quran? How do these two compare, and what does it mean? And then finally, how does this impact the way that Christians talk with Muslims and Muslims talk with Christians? Well, in order to start, I'm going to be starting with the New Testament. I'm going to talk about what's referred to as a freely transmitted text. And right off the bat, 3 facts of a freely transmitted text are that the more manuscripts one has, the more variants one will have. If you only have one witness, you will likely have no textual variants, but you will likewise have no textual basis upon which to believe you have the original text. And the more witnesses you have, the more confidence you have that you have the original text. So in other words, anything that's handwritten has mistakes. Copyists and scribes make mistakes. This is just the lot of anybody who is hand copying anything, especially for long documents. Some of the New Testament documents are, pages and pages and pages and pages, hundreds of pages long. And so we get this reality is that anytime you have something that's handwritten, there are copyist errors. This is true for everything. And so there's a discipline, a field called textual criticism, which looks at any document that we don't have the original for. Which is basically everything within the ancient world. This even flows into some of the Middle Ages. We don't have any of the original writings of the plays of Shakespeare, and so we do text criticism on the scripts of Shakespeare. This is true for religious documents, for writings of the classical era, like Tacitus and Pliny and Homer. It's true for the Epic of Gilgamesh in ancient Babylonian, Assyrian literature. And so anytime you don't have the original, you have to do analysis on the text in order to trace it back to the original. But that results in mistakes. And so one of the methodologies that's used is comparative analysis in order to trace back the original. It's not the only one. There are external and internal arguments that are used, but it is definitely one of them. In order to give you an illustration of this, I want to talk about a special printing of the King James Bible, which happened in 1631, because in 1631, there was a printing of the King James Bible, which had Exodus chapter 20, verse 14, failed to put in the word not in the phrase, thou shalt not commit adultery. And so this resulted in the phrase, thou shalt commit adultery. Now, this was obviously a typist error. And so they tried to destroy all these Bibles. But what would happen if that was our only copy of the Bible? Okay, or what would happen if we had 2 printings from 1631, one that said thou shalt not commit adultery and one that said thou shalt commit adultery? That would be an issue, right? Because if you only have 2, you have a lot less comparative analysis to be able to figure out, well, which one's the original, what is the original author, what is their intent. Now, obviously, this is an easy one because you would estimate from the other commands of the 10 Commandments that it would be thou shalt not commit adultery, based on both the structure of the other 10 Commandments, as well as, the moral code in general and the character of what is being talked about in the Mosaic Law. Nonetheless, you would have far less confidence within the rights of the text to be able to do that comparative analysis if you only had two. If you only have one, you have no differences, but you have to trust that that person got it right, who copied it. And if you have two, you have more confidence, but you're still relying on very little data. Now, for the New Testament in particular, we have 6,000 handwritten copies of the Greek New Testament, which is the original language that it was written in. That's everything from the 2nd to the 17th century. I closed it off at the 17th century because that's when you have the invention of the printing press. And so we do have copies after that, but I closed it off there because our handwritten copies drastically take a downward spiral because they're printing them from that point on. If you include the Latin, you have 10,000 Latin copies. And then if you include all the other ancient translations in language like Coptic and Georgian and Old Church Slavonic and Syriac and Ethiopic and Latin, words you can forget as soon as you hear them, that number comes out to 24,000 handwritten manuscripts. So you have a lot of data for the biblical New Testament. Now, like I said before, anything that's handwritten has mistakes. 24,000, that's a pretty big number. Well, that's going to result in a lot of mistakes, right? So how many mistakes? How many variants? How many errors? Well, we have approximately 140,000 words in the Greek New Testament. Now, if we have 140,000 words, how many differences within the manuscript tradition do you think we have? Well, actually, the number is between 400 and 600,000. So that seems like bad news right off the bat, right? That doesn't seem like a good situation. We have 3 variants per words. But remember what I was saying before in the sense that the vast majority of these copyist errors are easy to pinpoint. Let me give you an example of one of the most common. It's called the movable nu. Now, nu is the Greek letter N. And we have a similar rule grammatically to the movable nu in English in the sense that I say an apple, not a apple. An apple, not a apple. Some people say a apple. In English, you're not supposed to do that, really. You're supposed to say if the word begins with a vowel, you're supposed to, and it's a singular, you're supposed to put an N on the end of an, or in order to be grammatically correct. There's a similar rule in Greek where you could say lagousin, which means they say, or you could say lagousi, which means they say. Depending on the word and the suffix and prefix on the words before and after, you could put that N at the end of lagousi, and it would still say they say. Nonetheless, scribes who were copying and not reading, or sorry, they were copying but not speaking Greek, they were just reading it, were often confused about the movable nu. And so N's end up in places they shouldn't be, or taken out of places they should be for this particular reason, and those count as variants. Another one that I'll just go over briefly is exemplified if you turn to 1 John 3:1 in your New Testament. In the King James translation, which remember I said came around between 1604 and 1611, you have the text saying, "Behold, what manner of love the Father hath bestowed upon us, that we should be called the sons of God. Therefore the world knoweth us not, because it knew him not." Now, if you skip forward to nowadays and you hold up an NIV, a New International Version, you'll see it says, "See how great a love the Father has bestowed upon us, that we would be called children of God, and such we are. For this reason, the world does not know us, because it did not know him." Now, there's more than just updating of sort of old-timey language. You have this little phrase, "and such we are." Where does that come from? Well, this is an example of what's called homoteliuton, which is just a long Latin word that means similar endings. And what we have going on here, you'll see there's some Greek script. The oldest Greek manuscripts are what you see on the screen. That's underneath in that box is a screenshot I took of Codex Sinaiticus, which comes from the 4th century. And it's of this text. So it's all capitals, no spaces in between words, and little to no punctuation. It's called Scripta Continua. And a scribe saw the first MEN, which is in red on the top and then in the box on the bottom. That's the ending of the word klethomen. So he saw the word klethomen, and then he wrote the MEN down, went back, but when he went back, he saw the ending of the word esmen. And so he saw the second men, and he continued on from there, effectively cutting out the phrase kai esmen, which means, and we are. And so that is how that variant happened. The text that the King James translators were using was not manuscripts per se, but printed editions of the Greek New Testament, and the base manuscripts from those printed editions of the Greek New Testament, available at the beginning of the 17th century, were a collection of manuscripts that were later, and therefore they were of a tradition that had been copied and missed out this Kai Esmen. But because we have so many copies, and because now our copies go so early to the 2nd century effectively and respectively, we can pinpoint these things pretty accurately. We know exactly where things made their way into the text or made their way out. And what this illustrates is the way the New Testament manuscripts came into existence. So between the 1st and the 4th centuries, the first being when they were written by the original authors, Christians were very eager to get the message of the gospel out, the message of Jesus Christ. And so they didn't ask for your specific qualifications. And what this resulted in was that copies spread throughout all the ancient world at the time. And so you had copies in North Africa and in the Middle East, up into Europe, into the British Isles, and into Asia rather, very, very early on within the first few centuries. When this resulted in the fact that no one person or group could have ever controlled the text at any one point in time, because there were copies of these documents buried in the sands of North Africa that someone, say in Greece, if they wanted to, insert something into the text, or they wanted to start editing it or add doctrines or whatever, that would have been effectively impossible, because Christians in North Africa would have disagreed, and there would have been copies that would have been lost that we've actually found now, almost 2 millennia later, that would have revealed that these earlier copies said different things. And what this is called is a free transmission. The New Testament is a text whose transmission is not controlled by an external authority, such as a government, being widely copied without constraint. And so what this results in is the opposite of a controlled transmission, which is a transmission, a text, which is copied under the guidance of an external authority. This also exemplifies what scholars call multi-vocality. So just think of many vocality locations. So it's often asserted that, the Bible is something like a telephone game. I whisper into your ear and you whisper into the next person, and we go down the line till at the end, when the person repeats the phrase that I originally whispered, it's all messed up. Well, that's a single line of transmission. And there are rules to it, right? I'm only allowed to whisper in one person's ear, and so is the person after me, and everybody's only allowed to whisper. And so what this does is it is designed to corrupt the text. But when we look at the history of the New Testament, we see that it was written by multiple authors at multiple times in multiple places by multiple individuals to multiple audiences. And then those are copied at multiple times in multiple places by multiple copyists in multiple locations to multiple audiences. This is levels of multivocality. And as a result, we can look forward to finding even earlier copies, earlier manuscripts of the New Testament documents, as the free transmission of the text has provided us with a solid basis for asserting that we continue to possess the original readings of the authors themselves. Now, what's moving on the screen is P66. It's a 2nd century, late 2nd, early 3rd century copy of the Gospel of John. It's one of our earliest witnesses to the beginnings of John, because with codices, with early books, the beginnings and the ends tended to get very beat up or lost, because they're the ones that are most exposed. But this copy has the beginning of the entirety of the start of John preserved. And if you can read Greek on the screen, you'd see Enarche and Kai ha logos. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then you skip down a little bit and you can see close to the bottom, and the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. If you translate this, which I've followed along, Enarchean halagos and kai halagos and prostontheon, you follow along with either a modern English translation or a modern critical edition of the Greek New Testament. So word for word verbatim, it's exactly how I would translate this document out, is how I would read it in a modern English translation. And so the result of this is that we find documents like these that we can have great confidence in what the original author wrote because of these type of manuscripts. And so unlike something like the telephone game, I would argue that the New Testament is much more like a 100,000 piece puzzle. Now, if you opened up a box of a 100,000 piece puzzle, would it be more annoying if you opened it up and counted 99,900 pieces, meaning you were missing 100, or whether you counted 100,100 pieces, meaning you had, 100 more? Well, it might seem more annoying if you have more, but in reality, once you start to put the pieces together and you assemble the puzzle, you can see the image that's supposed to be there. You can see where there are pieces that don't belong. They're from other puzzles. You can see where, maybe your younger sibling has come in. They've tried to smash a piece in here where it doesn't belong. Or there are duplicates of pieces. Once you start to put the puzzle together, it's really easy to see, because of the amount of pieces, what things belong and what things don't. And I would argue this is what we have with the Bible, with the New Testament in particular. We have a puzzle that has more pieces than we need, but once we start to assemble them, it's very easy, or at least with a lot of hard work, it's very easy to pinpoint where things just don't belong. And so what we've gone over is a free transmission versus a controlled transmission, textual multivocality, and that last one I'm calling textual tenacity, or I'm highlighting what's called textual tenacity in the academic field. And all of these things, all of these factors, all of these methodologies give us confidence in being able to, trace something like the New Testament back to the original author. There's very little to no argument that we have what the original authors wrote. And even the arguments that we do talk about within textual variants that, mind you, might be significant in copies that are very fragmentary, none of them affect any essential Christian doctrine, and it's never the case that we just don't know what it is. It's almost always the difference between this word or that word, this phrase or that phrase. One of them is the original, and we know this because of the tenacity of the text. And so what we have with the New Testament is what I'm calling a spider web. We don't possess the original any longer. What Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Peter, Paul, Jude, James wrote. But we do have all of these copies and copies and copies and copies of copies of copies. And because of that, and because they are so early, and some of them are so well preserved, and some of them have a textual origin that goes back even earlier than the manuscript that is being looked at, we can see the spider web, and we can trace all of the lines back to the original. And in one sense, it's a little bit unfair what I'm doing to compare the Bible to the Quran, because the Bible is 66 books written over a period of 1,600 years on 3 different continents by 40 different authors in 3 different languages. The major languages are obviously Greek and Hebrew for the New Testament and Old Testament. There are about 13 chapters, particularly in the Old Testament, that are in Aramaic, whereas the Quran was revealed and then codified within a period of 25 years as one book in one location, the Arabian Peninsula, by one author. The Muslim will obviously argue that the author is God, but I'm going to go with the argument that the traditional hadith having Muhammad as the author, at least in a very naturalistic way. Although I understand the argument from the Muslim who say that Muhammad was not the author, he was just the mouthpiece of God. And we have an argument from the Quran itself of preservation, right? Surah 15, Ayah 9, indeed, it is we who sent down the Quran, and indeed we will be its guardian from corruption. And so because of this, when you read some of the literature on this topic, you'll get statements like Mazhar Qazi, who says Muslims and non-Muslims both agree that no change has ever occurred in the text of the Quran. The above prophecy of eternal preservation and purity of the Quran came true not only for the text of the Quran, but also for the most minute details of its punctuation marks as well. It is a miracle of the Quran that no change has occurred in a single word or a single letter of the alphabet, a single punctuation mark, or a single diacritical mark in the text of the Quran during the last 14 centuries. Now, with all due respect to my Muslim friends, what Qazi is saying here is just incorrect. It's a common kind of idea within traditional Sunni orthodoxy. But one of the reasons why it's incorrect is because we have old manuscripts of the Quran, right? So in 1972, the Sa'ana palimpsest was discovered in Sa'ana, Yemen. They were doing some updates on the mosque in Yemen there, and they kind of poked a hole in the wall, and these manuscripts fell out. And because of the investigative tools we have, we can do things like expose them to ultraviolet and radiocarbon light. And what that showed was that there was actually, this is what's referred to as a palimpsest. There was original copy of the Quran. It was washed clean, and then a different copy of the Quran was written on top. And we have a different text of the Quran underneath, which is shows variation in scribal accuracy from the copy that's written on top. And we have differences within the Quranic text from the Sa'al and palimpsest. In 2015, the Birmingham Quran was discovered, and likewise, this was showed textual variation within the manuscript tradition of the Quran. The Birmingham Quran is very important because it was a late 7th, early 8th century manuscript, which is very, very early. And it likewise showed textual variation. One of my first grad level papers was on analysis of some of the diacritical marks that differed within the Birmingham Quran. Likewise, not only that, but there are actually two different texts of the Quran floating around the world today. 97% of the Muslim world is reading a Hafs Quran, particularly a 1924 Egyptian printing of the Hafs Quran. But I have been to areas of North Africa where the Warsh Quran is being read. And the Warsh Quran, although only 3% of the world reads the Warsh Quran, it differs. It differs from the Hafs Quran. And traditionally throughout Islamic history, there have been differentiations within the copying process of both Warsh and Hafs copies. And so it's incorrect to say there's only one Quran in one sense, because historically there have been a number of iterations and readings and recitations of the Quran. Fred Donner, who's an Islamic scholar and scholar of the ancient Near East at it's University of Chicago, says, Quranic studies as a field of academic research appears today to be in a state of disarray. Those of us who study Islam's origins have to admit collectively that we simply do not know some very basic things about the Quran, things so basic that the knowledge of them is usually taken for granted by some scholars. Dealing with the other texts, they include questions as, how did the Quran originate? Where did it come from? And when did it first appear? How is it written? In what kind of language was it written? What form did it take? Who constituted the first audience? How was it transmitted from one generation to another, especially in its early years? When, how, and by whom was it codified? Those familiar with the Quran and the scholarship on it will know that to ask even one of these questions immediately plunges us into the realm of grave uncertainty and has the potential to spark intense debate. Now, I think actually Donner, although if you read the Quran in its historical context, he's clearly, and I've listened to a number of his lectures, he's brilliant. I think he's a little bit too pessimistic. I would actually give more benefit of the doubt to the traditional Islamic sources in the Hadith and the Sunnah to a certain degree. But the Hadith, I think, actually have more credibility than Donner ascribes to it. But this is actually a mainstream opinion in the Western world. The Eastern world is not really allowed to ask certain questions about the history of the Quran to the same degree that they are in the West. But in North America and Europe in particular, this is the mainstream understanding within the academic world of the history of Islam and the Quran. But I, as I said before, I think it's a little bit more pessimistic. I think if we're just talking about the Hadith for a moment, I'm just going to assume that the Hadith sources, particularly Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, are correct. And in combing through these, I've compiled sort of a history of the Quran in its revelation. So in 570, what we have is Muhammad being born. The Quran is first revealed in 609, and we have that recorded in a number of places. But particularly in, Bukhari, Book 1, we have the story of Muhammad going into the cave and meeting the angel Jibril. And at that point, he's, commanded to recite in the name of your God. And so at that point, you have the start of what is the revelation according to the traditional Islamic sources of the Quran. But Muhammad is in Mecca, which is it's a polytheistic community. And so he's preaching monotheism. And so they don't like that. He runs into some trouble. And so in 622, he flees to Medina. He flees to Medina, but he gains a significant following in Medina, and he goes back in 630 and he overthrows Mecca. Now, he does this peacefully, and we have this recorded in Sahih Bukhari, Book 5. And so he overthrows Mecca peacefully. He gets rid of all of the idols in the Kaaba. And at that point, you have sort of a Muslim takeover of the Arabian Peninsula. The majority of the Arabian Peninsula during Muhammad's lifetime is then converted by different means. And there's sort of a call to the Christian and Jewish tribes throughout the Middle East to come and recognize the Prophet Muhammad. The majority of them don't. But that aside, Muhammad dies in 632. Muhammad dies. And at this point, the Quran has not been written down. There is no evidence from any of the hadith, Sahih Muslim, Sahih Bukhari, or any of the other hadith that you look at that says anything about the Quran being written down in its entirety at this point. The Quran at this point is a memorized document. There are individuals following Muhammad around. They're called the Qur'an. They're the immediate followers and disciples of Muhammad. They memorize what he's saying. And so you have this period between, 609 and 632, as I said before, that is this period where the Quran is revealed. But Muhammad dies, and then you have, the debate as to who will succeed Muhammad, which starts, the origins of the Sunni Shia debate. Granted, there's a lot more that goes into that is developed over the decades and centuries. But you also have individuals, tribes within the Arabian Peninsula. They find out Muhammad's dead, and they basically say, okay, well, we're not Muslims anymore. We never really were. We just, didn't want to suffer penalties for not converting. And so then you have a period which is recorded in a number of Islamic sources, traditional Islamic sources. There's a good recounting of it in the Sirat Rasul Allah by... by Ibn Ishaq. So my translation here is by Ghulam. But Ibn Ishaq records, the life of Muhammad, Surat Rasul Allah. And so it records some of these, after Muhammad's death and preceding what happens within the wars of the apostasy. And there's one battle particularly that happens during these wars at Al-Yamama. And at Al-Yamama, we have this recording of quite a few of the Muslims, the Qur'an, who had memorized the Quran, dying. And so the Caliph at the time, Abu Bakr, his advisors come to him and they basically say like, we're going to be in trouble because these people are dying and we will lose the Quran. And so this starts a period of collation of what happens to be the Quran. And so you have quotes that you find like Ibn Abu Dawood, who says, Umar was once looking for the test of a specific verse of the Quran. He vaguely remembered. Oh, sorry, I'll go back to that. That was my mistake. We're right here. Umar was once looking for a test of a specific verse of the Quran. He vaguely remembered. To his deep sorrow, he discovered that the only person who had any record of that verse had been killed in the Battle of Yamama, and that the verse was consequently lost. That's in Sunan Abu Dawood, Kitab al-Mishhaf. And so that's said. Ibn Umar, recorded in As-Sayuti, says, let no one of you say that he has acquired the entire Quran, for how does he know that it is all? Much of the Quran has been lost. Thus let him say, I've acquired what is available. Now this is Ibn Umar, who's the son of the second Caliph and the brother of the Prophet Muhammad. And so you have these kind of statements being said because the Quran is oral at this point in time. It's not a written document. It's a memorized document. And so this starts the process at the Battle of Yamama. We also have Abu Bakr, who himself, recorded in Sahih Bukhari, book 6, says, so I started looking for the Quran and collecting it from what was written on palm stalks, thin white stones, and also from the men who knew it by heart, till I found the last verse of Surat al-Tawbah, repentance, which Abu Khazaimah al-Ansari and I did not find it with anybody other than him. So they're looking for this particular verse in the Quran. They can't find it with anybody except one person who survived at the Battle of Yamama. And so that means that there were verses that were only memorized by one particular individual that were like known in the community, but there was only one person who had it. What's to say that there weren't other verses like that? And so starting with Abu Bakr, you have this period which ends with Uthman, and Uthman, the other caliph, in 635, starts a process where his advisors come to him and they say, save this nation before we differ about the book, talking about the Quran, as the Jews and Christians did before us. That's Sahih Bukhari. And so you have this, period of time where Uthman is realizing that Abu Bakr started this process of collation, but the problem is now they have written Qur'ans that differ with one another because people are remembering things slightly differently. And there's a record of Qur'ans being longer with some people and shorter with others. And so this is a period that scholars of the ancient Near East and Islamic history records as being referred to as the Uthmanic Revision, where Uthman collects all of these copies, he standardizes the text, and he destroys the differing copies. There's a later writer, Al-Hindi, in the 9th century, who I think this is a little bit hyperbolic, but this is kind of the narrative of how this happened. Heavy penalties were threatened against the disobedient. All the leaves they could secure were shredded and boiled in vinegar till they were sodden. Nothing remained, not even the smallest fragment that could be deciphered. This is talking about the Qur'ans that differed from Uthman's. Ubay ibn Ka'b, who was one of the immediate companions of Muhammad, said, Umar said, Ubay was the best of us in the recitation of the Quran, yet we leave some of what he recites. So he's one of the best reciters, but they're leaving out some of what he recites, what he's remembered from the Prophet Muhammad reciting. But Ubay says, I have taken it from the mouth of Allah's messenger, and I will not leave it for anything whatever. And we actually have disagreements with individuals like Ubay ibn Ka'b, of individuals who had entire chapters that Uthman did not include. And so there's a little bit of a battle. In fact, if you read between the lines in the hadith, it appears that a few of these people, potentially Ubay himself, lost their lives because of their refusal to give up their copies of the Quran that they had recorded, as Ubay says here, taken from the mouth of Muhammad himself. And so what do we do with this? Well, if you remember, the free transmission of the New Testament has a number of factors, one of which is that there is no centralized authority who's controlling the text, which means that in one sense, it's annoying because you have all these copyist errors, but in another, it allows us 2,000 years later to compare the copies and do internal and external analysis to be able to have a lot of confidence in the text. That is not what we have with the Quran. What we have with the Quran is a oral document, right, in its originality, that was memorized by the immediate followers of Muhammad. And then we have not a spider's web, but a single thread, where there's a little bit more differentiation at first, but then it's standardized. This is literally the difference between a controlled transmission and a free transmission. And the reality of this is that it allows scholars, and this is why guys like Fred Donner say what he says, very little confidence to be able to trace the original text back, because you have to trust that Uthman got it right. And a lot of the Qur'an, a lot of Muhammad's own immediate followers said Uthman did not get it right. And so we have the hadith themselves, the Sahih hadith, the reliable hadith, even recording individuals who were companions, immediate companions of Muhammad, declaring Uthman's text is not what they heard from Muhammad. But Uthman's text, or a version of it, a 1924 Egyptian printing of the Hafs version of it, is what modern Muslims read today. It is. There's no debate about that. And so the problem with that is that there is very little to no transparency and very little confidence that we have what originally came from Muhammad's mouth. If you look at a Greek New Testament, so this on the screen is a critical edition of the Greek New Testament. I have a number of them behind me. These are all critical editions of the Greek New Testament. What you have on the top is the Greek. This is a section of Matthew chapter 5. And you have the Greek up there, and underneath you have what's called the critical apparatus. This is a documentation of all the differences that would affect translation. Anybody can buy one of these. You can go on Amazon and get them. You can get your local Indigo to order one. In fact, if you are studying Greek, you can just call the United Bible Society and they'll just send one to you for free. This is the history of the New Testament text. We are not hiding anything. We're not. Everything's transparent. You can look at the readings yourself. Any true variant that affects translation will be mentioned in any modern translation as a footnote. And because of this, there is transparency. There's an ability to see what the history of the text looked like and how it was changed over time. And that gives us confidence to look back and see, how we can compare and trace the original text back. There's no critical edition of the Quran. There have been attempts to sort of do it. One of my personal friends, Andy Bannister, who has a PhD in Islamic studies from Oxford University and does computer coding. He's been on the team that's working on software it's called the Quran Gateway, and it is an attempt to try to start this. But we have 2,000 years, 1,800 years, arguably, of textual critical conversations with the New Testament, of comparative analysis. The textual criticism of the Quran has really only started in the last 50 years. And it's even closer to the latter half of the 50 years. And so there's very little to go off of in order to be able to accurately represent what the original text means. What does this mean? Okay. I think what it means is that we can have confidence in the text of the New Testament, not in spite of the evidence, but because of it. And the Quran has much, much less on its side in terms of multi-vocality and tenacity and therefore reliability as a whole. This is the conclusion of almost every Islamic scholar in the West who analyzes this information. Why? Because if we apply the same standards to the New Testament or to Homer or to, the author of Gilgamesh or to the Canterbury Tales, if we use the same methodology and say we can be sure that what we have is what the original is an almost exact, if not exact, representation of what the original author said, and we apply that same methodology to the Quran, what we see is a controlled transmission. We see very little to no multifocality. We see very little to no tenacity. And therefore, our ability to have confidence that what we have is what the original was is very, very low. And that includes all of the internal and external sources in the Hadith that say a number of times by the companions of Muhammad that there were differentiations in the earliest recitations of the Quran, significant differentiations to the point of chapter differences. So how does this impact the way Christians and Muslims talk with one another? Well, I think we can see from the history, and I've only skimmed the surface, that the Quran has a history. The Quran has human fingerprints all over it in terms of its codification, in terms of the Uthmanic Revision, in terms of the fact that what is read today is a 1920s printing, which was not a compendium of scholars, but just that's the printing that ended up happening and getting printed most often. And the Quranic transmission compared with the New Testament reveals that one is ultimately far more reliable. And with all due respect, my Muslim friends, that is the New Testament. And so as just kind of like an appendix, what I want to do very quickly is I want to show you an example. I have on the screen, unfortunately, I was trying to get pictures of the manuscripts themselves, but if you're able to trace them down, the standard 1924 text and translation of Surah 3, Ayah 158 says, whether you die or are martyred, all of you will be gathered before Allah. Okay. There's a very important manuscript, which is very early, Quran manuscript 328, which is also known as the Great Paris manuscript because it's housed in Paris. It has a different diacritical mark. And the difference in the diacritical mark means that there's a differentiation in the text, which is rather significant. It says, whether you die or are martyred, all of you will not be gathered before Allah. So it's a difference of being gathered or not being gathered. That's a significant variant. And that's one that we find within the manuscript tradition of the Quran copies that we have, the ancient copies of the Quran. Now, let me just run through this very quickly. for my Muslim friends. Now, I realize there's a little bit of an issue going on with my the screenshots of my Arabic. They're not quite exactly right, but if you can forgive me for that at the moment, just notice that. Surah 3:3 says, "He has sent down upon you, O Muhammad, the book and truth, confirming that which was before it, and he revealed the Torah and the gospel." So here we have one of the iterations within the Quran itself that the Torah and the gospel are revealed. They're revealed by God. They're used with the Arabic word natsal, means sent down, which is the same word that the Quran uses for itself. The gospel and the Torah, once again, say, O people of the scripture, you are standing on nothing until you uphold the law of the Torah and the gospel. And what has been revealed to you from your Lord, and what which has been revealed to you from your Lord will surely increase, many of them in transgression and disbelief, so do not grieve over the disbelieving people. So once again, we have another declaration that the Torah and the gospel are sent down. You know, they're inspired by God. Muhammad is said, if he has doubts, to look to the Christians and Jews in Surah 10:94. So if you are in doubt, O Muhammad, about that which we have revealed to you, then ask those who have been reading the scriptures before you. The truth has certainly come to you from your Lord, so never be among the doubters. So basically, if Muhammad has doubts, go to those who had the books before you. Who are those that had the books before you? Well, the Torah and the gospel are already the ones that have been highlighted in the Quran as that which are the books that were revealed before. Likewise, nobody can change God's words, right? Say then, is it other than Allah I should seek as judge, while it is he who has revealed to you the book explained in detail? And those to whom we previously gave the scriptures know that it is sent down from your Lord in truth, so never be among the doubters. And the word of your Lord has been fulfilled in truth and justice. None can alter his words, and he is the hearing, the knowing. So nobody can change God's words, and that's in context to the previous scriptures, which are mentioned in Ayah 114. Now, we know exactly what the gospel and the Torah look like in this time frame, in the 7th century. In fact, here's a copy. It's Syriac. It's from Syria. Syriac is a version of Aramaic of the Gospels and some letters of Paul, and then includes the Old Testament letters, specifically Nehemiah, of the prophetic writings. But I've done analysis on Codex Ambrosianus. It reads identical with, minor variation to what I have in my modern English translations. We know what the gospel was in Muhammad's day. And so when the Quran in the 7th century is talking about the Injil and the Torah, the gospel and the Torah, we know what that looked like. And so in order for it to be an effective revelation, it has to be effective in communicating something that would actually have made sense to the original audience. And so we know what the gospel looked like in the 7th century. We know what it looked like in the 2nd century. We know what it looked like now, and looks like now. And so it's problematic if what your reaction to this is saying, well, that's not the same gospel. That's not the same Torah as we have today. It's been corrupted. Well, I'm afraid the evidence doesn't show that, and we actually know what the Al-Injil, the people of the gospel, were reading in Muhammad's day when those words were spoken. Likewise, Christians in Surah 5, Ayah 46 and 47, are said to judge by the gospel. It says, and we sent down, following their footsteps, Jesus, the son of Mary, confirming that which came before him in the Torah, and we gave him the gospel, in which was guidance and light, confirming that which preceded it, of the Torah as guidance and instruction for the righteous. Now, this is the kicker. And let the people of the gospel, the Al-Injil, that's me, right? I'm a Christian. I'm a person of the gospel. Judge by what Allah has revealed therein, and whoever does not judge by what Allah has revealed, then it is those who are the defiantly disobedient. My Muslim friend, if you're listening to this, I do not want to be the defiantly disobedient before God. However, if I take this seriously as a person of the gospel, and I judge by what Allah has revealed therein, in the context of that is the gospel, and I judge the Quran by the gospel, I find the Quran false. I find it false. And we see, I think, this stream. We have the Torah, which is given to Moses, and then we have the gospel, which is given to Jesus, which confirms the Torah, and then we have the Quran, which is given to Muhammad, which is confirms the previous revelations. However, when we read the gospel and the Torah, they outly contradict what the Quran says. And so we have to do, and what, the Muslim sheikh who I quoted earlier from his book, he has to destroy that ring. And he has to come up with a sort of methodology of corruption within the gospel and the Torah in order to have the preservation of the Quran. Because the Quran continually talks about the gospel and the Torah being given by God as a confirmatory utterance, being natsal, as I said before, sent down. That's problematic. That's problematic for the traditional Islamic narrative. We know what the Christians were reading in Muhammad's day. In order for these types of commands to be effective and understood by Christians, then it would have to have been the gospel and the Torah that the Jews and the Christians were reading then. And likewise, if it was to some group of the people of the gospel, to some gospel we no longer have, then all of the mentionings of the people of the gospel are invalid today, because that group no longer exists. And so there are whole sections of the Quran that speak to a group that is non-existent anymore. I think that's problematic. I think that's problematic for the understanding of the Quran. So if you do away with that link, you have to get rid of the others, which I think actually invalidates the argument the Quran itself is trying to make. So I hope that makes sense. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this if you've gotten this far. My Muslim friends, I hope this has encouraged you. Go back, check my sources, read the Hadith, read Sahih Bukhari, read Sahih Muslim, look up those verses that I talked about, and look into the history of the New Testament. I think, with all due respect, as an academic within this field, when we analyze the data, the exact same methodology by which we know that the New Testament is accurate, reliable, historical is the exact same. We know the Quran isn't.